Okay, so today we're going to be learning about the nature and role of hierarchy and internal power structures within belief systems and ideologies. Okay, so the nature of hierarchies and power structures. You may be familiar with the nature of the hierarchical structure or power structure within your own belief system, because I know many of you do follow a belief system and regularly attend some form of church or religious place. So the first prominent feature of a hierarchy and power structure is that it's usually rigid. And what that means is that it is very clear who does what and why they do it. So within the power structure, each individual person or group of people have a clear role, and that usually doesn't change. And it was also very clear on how they have gotten to that position. And that tends to stay the same as well. That doesn't usually change. If you are climbing the ranks, the reasons why you are climbing those ranks doesn't change. And that leads to the next point, which is that it tends to be unchanging. And this is not only in the sense that it's rigid, but it also means that it remains the same in all locations. So just like as an example, the Catholic Church, you have the Pope, which is the head of the church, and then you have your priests, but you also have your archbishops and things like that. And just because we're here in Australia and the Pope is in Italy, that doesn't change the fact that he is in charge. So it is unchanging based on location, or environments, but it is also unchanging in terms of time as well. The Pope has remained the head of the church throughout centuries. So in terms of the power structure, it tends not to change, mostly because that power structure usually is tied into the religious text. So it's kind of stoned in, it's engraved. The other thing is that it really allows for dissent. So dissent means that, and we'll become very familiar with that term, it means holding opinions that differ from the mainstream. So this can be within and outside of the power structure or hierarchy. Within the power structure, especially if you're on the lower ranks, you cannot express a different opinion to those that are above you. You must follow what they are suggesting. It also doesn't allow for dissent amongst its congregants as well. People have to follow and listen to those that are in charge. It is expected that if you are, especially at the place of worship, that you will listen to and respect those in charge, and you will not question their authority nor their understanding or what they're preaching. And the last thing is that there's fairly strict rules around who can and cannot join the ranks of the power structure and the hierarchy. So there's very clear reasons or requirements to either join the power structures and ranks or to climb those ranks. So for an example, quite a lot of Protestant churches require that for you to become a priest or a member of the power structure within the church, you have to have done some form of theological study. As for the Catholic Church, it requires that you have devoted a certain amount of time to the Catholic Church and to the Christian faith, and that you have done some good works around the church in order to continue to climb that. Interestingly enough, most belief systems around the world generally tend to exclude women from these power structures and hierarchies, so that is something to take note. So examples of power structures and hierarchies, we should be familiar with a lot of these images, but we'll just go through some of them anyway, just to refresh your memory and to make sure you understand what a power structure and hierarchy looks like in belief systems. So that is a priest, although to be honest, that kind of looks like the Pope, so could be either one, of a church leading a sermon, and then that definitely is the Pope, so obviously the head of the Catholic Church. That is Pastor Phillips, so obviously we remember him from the Westboro Baptist Church. He was the head of the church, was also the grandfather of most of the congregants at that church. So that's a picture of the Brahmin, so not necessarily the head of the Hindu faith, but definitely has a clear status and hierarchy within the Hindu faith. Obviously that's the Dalai Lama. So he is not necessarily the head, but the figurehead of Buddhism. That is an imam, so he is not the head of the Islamic Church, as we'll not Islamic Church, so the Islamic belief system, as we will come to learn about. But he does lead the prayers and kind of advises people on script or adherence on the script in his local community. This is not like, as we will learn, Islam doesn't necessarily have a clear power structure and hierarchy, but there has been one that's formed over time. And so the last picture is an example of a form of hierarchy in Islam. And so the Grand Mufti of Egypt, so he's essentially the head of the Sunni Islam in Egypt, and he's the man in black. He's greeting the Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, which is the man in the white. So these are all examples of hierarchies and power structures, just so you're familiar with them, and we can kind of reflect on how they work and what their role is within the belief systems. Okay, so the role of hierarchies and power structures, there's clear, I would argue that the main role of these hierarchies and power structures is to ensure that the belief system continues to run smoothly. Most hierarchies are there to allow for that belief system to function on a fairly reasonable level continuously within the environment that it's in. But there are clear kind of roles breaking down to that to allow for them to do that. So the first one is reinforce authority. So as looking at any hierarchy or power structure, especially for the adherents that belong to those belief systems, it is clear who is in charge and why they are in charge. Which also, as you know, mentioned before, helps to rid of dissent. So if it's clear why someone's in charge and why you're not, then it's hard to argue against what they're suggesting or preaching about. It also allows for them to kind of demand respect and authority because they are the ones that are in charge within the belief system. So it's very clear who is in charge, and therefore that reinforces authority. The next one is to provide a clear chain of communication. Most belief systems exist on a global scale, and therefore this tends to be someone in charge on a national level who feeds information to the local place of worship and then to the congregants. So, for an example, like the Pope of the Catholic Church lives in Rome. Then the next kind of chain of communication for at least the believers of the church is to the archbishops, who are in charge of major towns and cities around the world, as we'll come to see. They'll feed their information down to the priests or bishops, and then that'll be fed down to the congregants. Congregants don't have access to the Pope on a interaction scale, so they don't have personal access to them. So the only way they get information from the Pope is through their local priests and bishops. So it allows for information to be spread fairly easily, and without it, it would be very hard to remain that consistency through belief systems. So providing a clear chain of communication is a very significant role within belief systems. And then the last thing is that it sets the agenda, tone, and teachings of an organisation, which obviously is linked to the clear chain of communication. So by doing this, it allows for consistency across the various places of worship. It also allows for emphasis on particular values and beliefs within the belief system. So it allows for the local church to know what their focus should be on when they are running sermons and preaching. It allows for that emphasis within the belief system that one individual member from a local church, say in Castle Hill, can go and talk to another local member of a Protestant church in Mosman, and their understandings of their belief system will be fairly similar, even with those slight differences of emphasis. And that's kind of what that power structure allows for, that consistency within the different areas and places of worship. Okay, so just a quick example of the power structure. I know I've kind of already mentioned this, but we'll just go into it just a little bit more. So the Catholic Church, I think the Catholic Church is a really good example of this because it has a clear and noticeable hierarchy, and each group or individual has a clear responsibility or different tasks for their various locations. So we're just going to go through that quickly. So obviously you have the Pope at the top. He's the head of the Catholic Church and essentially a ruler. what he says goes in terms of what the Catholic Church focuses on and preaches about. So he's the head, he's in charge, that's not changing. Underneath him is the cardinals. Their main job is to elect a new pope when the other one dies or retires, but that rarely happens, so it's usually when they die. That's their main role. So they're not necessarily involved in the kind of the church dealings, but they are involved in maintaining the head of the Catholic Church, so it's a very vital role. Then underneath that is the archbishops. So they run the Catholic churches in large cities around the world. So you'll have one archbishop for Sydney, you'll have one archbishop for Paris, and so on and so forth. So they run the major cities around the world. Then underneath that is the bishops. They run the small cities as well as towns. And then underneath that you have the parish priests or priests, and they run the church. So the parish priests are kind of like the head priest of a specific church. Then underneath that you have the priests, and the priests are kind of like the helpers of the parish priest. And then underneath that you have the laity, and the laity help with the running of the church. So examples of that could be things like nuns and brothers, and that's a clear example of the hierarchy. As you see, each individual group has a specific role within the church, and they kind of feed the information down to one another. It is also clear who has the authority and who is in charge above you. So for the laity, they know that above them is the priests, and then above that is the parish priest, and so on and so forth. And the reasons why they are in that power structure or the level in which they're at is partly to do with their gender, because women can't go any further than the laity, but also partly to do with their commitment to the church, commitment to the faith, and good works around the local community and their church, and then as they continue to grow throughout the ranks. So there we go, that's examples of the roles of hierarchies and power structures in belief systems and ideologies, as well as the nature of hierarchies and power structures within belief systems and ideologies.